Hey everyone, and welcome to today's Q&A stream. I'm here today with Daniel. Daniel, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hey everyone, thanks Luke for inviting me. Last time was we had a nice conversation, so it's good to be back.
Yep, glad to have you around. So today's stream is a Q&A stream. You guys can ask us any question around Photon multiplayer, or in this case, we have Daniel here, and he's an expert on physics and multiplayer physics. And that's a very tricky topic, right? So if you have questions specific to that, right, feel free to ask.
Yeah.
So
So
we're
yeah,
s-
so for you that does not that Helsinki, yeah, for you that do not know me, I'm the lead physics developer of the quantum team, and I've also worked on the fusion SDK as well, mainly on the lag compensation feature and the network transform behaviors. So as Luke mentioned, my area of expertise is physics. So yeah, please shoot questions either related to physics or multiplayer in general. One of a specific question regarding one of the SDKs or not. Um,
we do have a very interesting question here,
yeah,
which
I'm
is
not sure
how
I
did
know
the
the answer
Photon
though.
logo
Yeah,
come to be, right?
yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah, I'm curious now as well. I think we need to ask internally to those that are in the company for longer. Maybe they have an idea.
Yeah, but I want to know now, right? But yeah,
Yeah,
Photon has been around for a very, very long time.
correct. Yeah.
So I don't know what the logo would represent here. But
Hmm.
yeah, compiling symbol, loading, I don't know.
Loading. Yeah.
Maybe
Well,
many peers connected in a circle. I don't know.
makes sense.
It's
Yeah.
yeah.
I think that's a good hypothesis.
So yeah, guys, if you have questions, just ask them in the chat on YouTube or Twitch. We're here to answer them for you.
Look, have you been following what the the developers are showing up in in the game gen channel, the show off chat,
Showcase.
the showcase? Yeah. Have you been following? I followed in the first weeks, but have not seen it recently. I was wondering if you guys had interesting use cases to share with us there.
Yeah, I've looked at it. I'm always incredibly amazed by the like graphical output teams are able to do because I'm just a programmer myself. But I look into that channel and I see like this super detailed model of a 3D space rocket, and it just looks fucking awesome. And then there is a multiplayer game around that, right? And I can just do like simple boxes and cubes and stick figure drawings. So yeah, seeing what people are able to achieve, like the quality of the entire game, that amazes me each time.
Yeah, nice. So Bruno has an interesting question. He has about player input and how to make it feel better. So yeah, one of the things that we need to keep in mind when using SDKs like Fusion or Quantum is that clients do prediction on their side, and they they predict what would be the inputs of the other players. So this usually means that the client assumes that the other clients, the remote clients, will continue to do what they have been doing in in the latest frame, the latest inputs they received. Because although like professional gamers, their inputs change quite frequently, it's still not as frequent as the simulation updates, or at least most of the time this prediction, like assuming that the input will continue to be the same as it was on once last acquired, is a fair assumption for in most cases, right? So if the remote client was moving right, it's a fair assumption that it will continue to move right. Okay, so once you reconcile with the state, either because on Fusion you received a new state saying that, hey, my character stopped moving to the right, now I stopped, or on Quantum when you received the confirmed inputs from that player and realize that, hey, it actually stopped moving to the right, then you need to kind of reconcile your visual representation of what you believed was the state of the simulation, right? So this usually involves, if you see things in a predicted time frame, then this usually means smoothing the correction so that you can now display the visual representations of the state in a more correct way, but without like instantly correcting everything and just feeling glitchy. So there are a few things to make this feel better. One is to like have an acceleration and deacceleration factor to character's movement. So instead of abruptly like stopping the character, have some kind of deacceleration. So when there is some kind of misprediction, the difference between the correct state and the wrong state predicted is smaller. So it's easier to correct and there is less error. So this is one of the ways to smooth things out a bit, having some kind of acceleration and deceleration factor in character movements.
Yeah, and one thing to mention there as well is quantum being an input passing deterministic simulation. It always passes the player inputs to every client, and then the clients are able to use that data to do predictions based on that input, right? But
Right.
if you're using Fusion, this is not the case, right? Because Fusion is state sync. You always
Mhm.
only have the inputs of your own player. So I think here the example was an air hockey game. So assuming you use predicted physics with that, or no, it wasn't. That was a different question. Anyways, so if you use predicted movement or physics for one player, and then you have another player, and you do nothing, then one will be in the predicted space and the other will be in the snapshot interpolated space, right? So they will feel like they're behind. So if you
Mhm.
want to correct that, you have to manually do that.
Yeah.
Either you can do something like quantum, where you make the input a networked field in Fusion, right? And that gives you
Right.
access to it, and then you can predict based on that. Or
Mhm.
you can predict based on velocity or something similar, right?
Exactly. Yeah, you can kind of network the current velocity of whatever you are simulating, and on the client, when it needs to predict a few ticks, then you can use the less known velocity, like the less state, as to extrapolate and like continue moving the object, even though you did not receive the newest value yet.
So, what else do we have? We have a bunch of good questions here. So,
So no
are we
artist.
pretty? Hmm?
Yeah, sorry. Go on.
So, there is a question about whether we are participating in the jam and how that is going.
Are you? Look.
Not anymore. I wanted to, but
I am participating with a couple of dev friends from the quantum team. We are developing an interesting concept. Um, we want to make like two groups of player. Like we are calling it bubbleheads and trouble. So part of the players are bubbleheads, and they kind of have a light in them, and they are stronger together, and you have the troubles, which are like hunting these bubbleheads, and they are in a quite like a dark maze, so they are mainly guided by their lights, and like the bubbleheads attract each other to be close together, while the troubles are like hunting the lights that they find. So yeah, we've been developing this in quantum, but in a very light pace, like to because we do this in like off work hours just to have fun, and we will not submit this as part of the competition, but we kind of wanted to get into the feeling of the gym. Yeah, so it's going fine. Last time I was here, I mentioned that I was a bit behind the schedule. I had like some features to implement, but it's working nice, and we want to have a like a playable build this week still. So yeah.
Oh, nice. Yeah, I'm sure people are eager to see that. Like, it sounds super interesting. Like the concept of
Yeah, Juan came.
it has this reconnect idea, right? So
Correct. Yeah,
it's an
you want to,
interesting
the
interpretation.
bubbleheads want to reconnect, and the troubles want to prevent that from happening, basically.
Yeah, exactly. So, do we have new samples for Fusion? Maybe an MMO? Uh, we do not have an MMO sample, I can tell you that much.
Yeah. So you guys
But
probably saw the BR200 sample that was released in partnership with Unity Multiplay. So this is, I believe, the latest sample we released, right, Luke?
yes, I
And
think so.
it's not an MMO, but yeah, it can handle 200 players, so quite a big player count.
Yeah, and we also have some samples in the work which we can't talk about them, but I've played them and they are very, very good. So there are some amazing Fusion samples coming soon. I think they might be circle only, but I'm not sure. But yeah,
Hmm.
we have some great new stuff. Mm,
So Joseph has a question. I believe this is related to quantum because it's an ECS, right? So what are some good ECS patterns when dealing with gameplay that deals with multiple different kinds of entities? So assuming that you're using quantum, Joseph, you have available a kind of system that is a system filter. So you kind of define a set of components that can mean something. For instance, if an entity has a transform, a player link, and some sort of game actor specific component, then you can consider this component set as okay, this is a player entity, right? So this is a player control entity, let's say. So you can use these filters to have system-specific logic that acts on entities that fill in these characteristics, right? You can even say, I want entities that have these components and do not have uh, these two or three components. For instance, you want to exclude um, entities that are, for instance, AI control. So you could have a component that basically signalizes that we, even if you do not have specific data in that components, there is one approach that is called flag components, in that you can use a component just for the sake of signalizing something. For instance, you want to state that a character or an entity is dead, or so you could use a component that's called, for instance, dead, and it does not have any state on it. It's just a simple component. And for instance, you could put it on entities that are considered dead in your gameplay logic. So your movement system, for instance, could iterate on entities that have a character controller but do not have the dead component. So you want to iterate over living and alive and moving entities, right? And so there are a few combinations you can do with filters to include or exclude other entities, and filters are very smart when iterating over those. So if you can use flag components to like close the subset, and you want to work on a very few amount of entities that have this specific component, the future a future can do wonders for you. So I think it's a nice pattern there. I like to use is flag components.
And I think one thing people often struggle with, right? ECS makes it very nice to make these small separated systems working on a small set of components. But
Correct.
then once your game grows, it's
Hmm.
hard to make sure that stuff stays separate from each other and doesn't become an intertwined
Yeah.
mess of systems. Do you have any advice for people running into that problem for how to keep that code clean and disconnected?
Yeah. So, especially for developers that are coming from this game object less ECS world, it's easier if you have this archetype characteristic, let's say, like having a fairly large sub set of components that define a more complex entity. For instance, you can have quite complex logic in a player controlling system, for instance, that deals with character movement, that deals with damage, that deals with shooting or interactions and queries, physics queries, and you could have all of this in a like big system that does all of it at once. Or you could have like you said, look, things like very fine grained system that only deals with specific components. So, for instance, you could have an input system that reads the player input and adds or not a movement component to that entity. Then later you have a movement system that reads the data from this component, and this component could come from player input, but could also have been added by AI logic that like emulates player inputs. And the system, the movement system in this case, does not need to know who created the movement data, if a player input or an AI or a bot. So you could dive into these very fine-grained system. Neither of the two are right or wrong approaches. It's more it's better to just how you feel and your team feels more comfortable with working. If you like these more um, complex systems, but just a few of them, or those fine-grained system that handles very specific logic in very specific components. That's no right answer, but they are like opposite points of on a gradient that you can choose where you feel more comfortable with. And it's usually the best point is usually somewhere in the middle. Like if you go too extreme and you want to make a system for every component, maybe your code base will become very complex to understand, and for other people, other developers to, for instance, join your team and catch up on that and start working on the code base, they might take a lot longer than if you had fewer systems that handle more logic in them. So it's everything. It asks for some balance.
Yeah, and what I particularly like about Quantum is really we give you the choice to go anywhere in between, right? So
Yes.
you can basically go full object oriented and use like get component, like get pointer to access components and treat entities basically as objects. Or you can go really that ECS route, you can use signals and systems, keep them separated. So it's really up to you. And both ways can perform well if you implement them correctly. So we are not limiting you to one of them.
Correct. Yeah.
So the next question by Busy is super interesting. So it's what we think about instead of playing an online game, connecting like a large group of people together on a single machine, like connecting a lot of controllers or screens. And I think that's a super interesting idea because we have cloud gaming, right? So when you have cloud gaming with something like Google Stadia is a bad example because that was just shut down. How's the NVIDIA one called? I forgot.
Yeah.
Anyways, the cool thing there is you're basically streaming your inputs to the cloud and you're getting back a visual, right? So it kind of acts as a console, and it could also allow many people to connect to that server, right? Because on the cloud you can have better resources than a local PC, so you could technically have a few hundred of people connecting to the same cloud game. So I think
Mhm.
that's something interesting where we
It's
never
not
saw it.
suitable for every game genre, I would
Oh
say,
yeah.
but yeah, for some that do not require like an instant feedback or like reaction, very tight reaction time, it will be a lot of fun. Yeah. And by the way, look, the name is GeForce Now, the
Oh
cloud
yeah,
gaming
GeForce
from
Now.
NVIDIA. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, I think it's sad that we never saw something like that. So cloud gaming was always just the same content as you could get on your own machine.
Yeah.
I think it would be cool if there was a game that was really taking advantage of that option to have more hardware in the cloud, but maybe we will see that in the future at some point.
Yeah, it will be nice.
So, next question. When will
When will
Quantum be
Quantum
out?
be out? Yeah, we do not have news on that front. Like we said in the previous streams, soon we are working on that. We have a stable version out. Quantum 2.1 is our latest stable version, and this is the version we plan to make available, right, Luke? And we're just like ensuring everything is in place and ready to receive everyone.
Yeah, exactly. And right now we really can't give an ETA. We never give ETAs. It will be out when we are ready. The reason
Mhm.
it's not out is because we have still some more work to do. So it won't be out immediately after the game jam, but at some point after that. Okay, let's go to the next question, which is tips about level designing and designing systems easier in Unity, and whether we have some advice on good patterns to follow for that.
Is this on Fusion? Is this Fusion specific, Quantum specific, or multiplayer in general? Because I might have slightly different questions, answers for depending on the topic. Do you have something to say already, Luke, on that? Oh, Quantum. So
Ah, quantum.
busy mentioned Quantum. Yeah. So what we are doing, for instance, in our game gen project is that we kind of separated gameplay logic, like simulation logic, from game design and balancing and level design on Unity. So, for instance, I'm mainly working on the simulation logic. So I'm implementing those systems and kind of providing endpoints for the viewer. What are these endpoints? It could be, for instance, an event, if you know what I'm referring to. If not, please check the documentation. Events are exactly for that, like not notifying the view of something that happened on the simulation that it should know about and react accordingly. Um, or for instance, I have a manager component that kind of holds, in our case, the bubble heads. It holds information about their connections, how many bubble heads are connected, and like the center in their connection. And then I can communicate with my team saying, okay, we have a new component. We have this manager component that has information about this and that, and we have these two new events that notify when this or that happen, when a player dies or when a player reaches some location, for instance. And then on the view side, level designers can uh, use prototypes to build their logic and add key components to those prototypes. So, for instance, if one thing I like to do is do not change on the scenes, do not modify the scenes if I'm only working on the simulation logic. Unless, for instance, I want to have a separate scene just to test the new feature I'm working in, and then this scene could become a reference for the level designers or game designers that want to put these new features in the scenes that were already in development. So yeah, this is one approach I like to take in just separating and clearly separating between simulation and view, and have this kind of endpoints. So the player sends inputs and commands, the simulation sends events and make data available in an easy way for the view to gather, to poll and like display it in some way, right? So this is how I like to approach.
Yeah, and I think part of the question was also just how to design a level in the Unity editor in the scene, so make it convenient for a level designer, but then get
Hmm.
that information into Quantum, into the simulation, right? So
Right.
we do that with stuff like colliders, right? But
Hmm.
if someone wants to add more data to the simulation, custom
Hmm.
data, how should they approach this? Do you have
Right. Yeah.
advice
So
for them?
yeah. So we're mainly talking about prototypes for kind of mutable data in entities and stuff, and we're talking about static colliders and such, which are baked into the map asset, right? So the map asset can have a reference to any asset you want, a custom asset of yours that can bring other static data. For instance, you could bake the position of spall points or points of interest, like the starting point or end points of your course, or any kind of static data that is relative to that level, to that scene, can be baked on an asset and reference on the map, along with the static colliders that you can build. And all of the quantum static colliders can use uh, Unity colliders, regular Unity colliders, as reference, as source. So, for instance, you could drag a Unity box collider for reference, and then the quantum static box would be baked based on this Unity collider using the size and the scale of this Unity collider. So it's an easier way to and the same applies to entities and physics colliders for quantum entities in prototypes. So you could drag and drop Unity colliders as source. So you, if you had some project that was single player and you kind of want to migrate it to Unity, it's a nice way to kind of port everything without having to redefine each and every collider from scratch, right?
Exactly. Yeah. So baking really gives you there all the options you want. You can customize your own functions to bake data from the level, like from the scene into your assets, which you then can reference. Yeah. So the next question by Victory Toad is about Fusion, and it's about joining sessions and mainly also handling the case where joining a session fails or someone disconnects. And there, I think, first of all, my advice would be that you should handle this. So I think the way this works in Fusion is you get a task and this contains a result which tells you whether joining failed or worked, but I'm not entirely sure. Do you know, Daniel?
I'm trying to find the exact documentation that handles this. Uh, Maybe Victorito could share his question on Discord so we can
Oh, yeah,
kind of link him to the correct um, documentation
definitely. Yeah.
entries that handles this, the expected things that can happen during the joining phase. And if you have a specific issue, like you're stuck in a part of it in a certain situation, then yeah, you could share your case and ask for advice there as well. I do not have it right off the bat. I'm seeing the documentation here to see
Yeah.
if I find
Also,
it.
we do have some samples which I think show some of these approaches. So if I remember correctly, the Fusion application loop technical sample, it really shows you all these steps and possibilities. So if you fail connection, you get into like a failed connection screen. If you disconnect, you can reconnect. So it really shows you from like start to end how to like architect this kind of flow. So that would be a good starting point. That's the Fusion application loop sample. Yeah. next question by Bruno. Their game is a dynamic tile-based world, and they had each tile as a single network object in Fusion. And that started to cause issues, apparently. So they were switching to an approach where instead they have chunks or zones, and then they contain just the data for that zone. So, what do we think about this kind of approach?
So yeah, using separate network objects for each small unity of everything, if you have a lot of them, it will eventually become the bottleneck, right? So this, for instance, happened on the BR200 sample. And for instance, projectiles, it's not advisable to have a separate network object for each projectile. If you have 200 players in each one of them, is like might have like a dozen projectiles alive at the same time. Um, so yeah, this will not scale well, and eventually you need to switch like we did on the BR200 to have the player object having like a being working like a manager for the state of its projectiles, and they are in this state in ours it's not a separate object, but it's like um, concise data in a buffer, like you mentioned, a byte buffer. It could I'm not certain which kind of information you have on the you need to store for each tile. If it's just like on off, you could even be a single bit. So you could have a bit mask saying which tiles are currently enabled or disabled. So this would scale much better. So caveats,
Yeah,
no, I think I already found the caveat with the network objects approach. I think your new approach sounds better.
yes, this is a very popular approach for games like this. You just have chunks, and then each chunk stores their data, and then you still use interest to only get the chunks around you, right? And one thing you can do there to go even further, if your map is generated based on procedural generation or a seed or based on a starting state, then what you can do is instead of having each tile in the network array already as the data, as long as the chunk stays unmodified, so no one ever made a modification to it, you can just store all zero in there and then use the data from the seed to generate the tiles, right? So that way you can save yourself a bit on network traffic.
Cool. Yeah. The next question is from Joseph. He asked if are there any plans to add more physics joints to quantum? Yes, definitely. So this first iteration we did, it included fixed distance joints, spring joints, uh, and it's not fixed distance. It's called distance joints because you can have like a min max sort of approach. Spring joints and hinge joints, and we decided to wrap up with these three initial types because we wanted to make it available so people could test. We could see how the system behaves, and we had improvements since the release in earlier Quantum 2 versions, and we are confident to move on the next iteration on Quantum, on the next version of Quantum. So yeah, we want to work. We did not yet decided on which joints we want to implement first. If configurable joints, it's an interesting one, especially for ragdolls, right? Um, and they can handle quite complex cases. So it might be a good direction to go towards because it can solve many cases. Like it's like a Joker joint. You can like build your own logic if you do not find a specific joint that matches your use cases. You could have a configurable joint and build your own constraints. So it's a nice one. And we want also to add some features like brake force or brake torque to have some sort of callback, and maybe make the system more easily expandable. So you could, if you want and have the time to develop your own joint constraints, you could like um, fill in your joint types to the physics engine and have your constraint solving callbacks called, so you do not like, so you're not held back by the lack of some specific joint in the engine, in the engine as it comes. So yes, plans we have for new types or and for new features on the joints like brake force and brake torque, certainly.
So I think the next question is by Busy again, and it's about whether in Quantum, when you use a character controller, how you would implement the flying mode. So rather than a regular walking, jumping, 3D movement mode, how would you approach flying?
Well, character controller is a very game specific topic to approach, and many of successful games put a lot of attention and effort into making the character movement feel nice. Regarding flying, I think the first thing that comes to mind is just some kind of air control. So you have that in the default KCC configuration file. You can like enable air mode to allow the cases the character controller to control its direction while not grounded. So you definitely want that if you want a flying control a character. Um, if like if you fly much faster than you walk, then you might want also to temporarily increase your allowed max speed for the character. And there are two max speeds, right? One is defined on the asset, and as any data in quantum asset is, it must be immutable, and one that is on the character controller component itself that is initialized with the value from the asset. And as any other data in components, they are mutable and rollbackable. So you can modify temporarily, for instance, while the character is flying, you can modify its max velocity on the component. And once you are grounded again, reset it to be the configuration value or some other value you wish. So but regard specific implementations, I think you need to experiment to find what works best for your game, and that's why we expose most of the character controller logic on the documentation, because it's very hard and almost impossible to provide one KCC to rule them all, and like having solving all cases and handling all cases in one implementation, because each game wants to feel unique in some way, right? So you will need to work on that to achieve this uniqueness for how the character feels in your game.
Yeah, and it's such an important part, right?
Yeah,
Because your players, they will be controlling the character like 80% of the time they're playing the game. So you really need to make sure that works well. That's super important.
yeah.
And yeah, I
And that's
think as you
why.
mentioned, go
Sorry,
ahead.
go on.
Yeah, there are like two ways of doing this. One is you can play around with the existing parameters, like enable air control, reduce or disable gravity, play around with velocity, like stuff like that. Or then you can really go more advanced, take the raw functions that we expose, like moving and steering, and implement your own. And that will really give you a top quality character controller. So if you're
Mhm.
serious about making this feel really good, then that's the way to go. But you can also get pretty far with just playing around with the built-in config.
Yeah, yeah. So the default character controller that comes with Quantum was built with mainly two things in mind. One is good for prototyping, and two, it is fast, like very fast, and it that's why it only uses a single shape overlap, and it does not do any kind of continuous contact detection, collision detection. Um, so if you need this kind of more complex interaction, it is important that you build from our ideas. They can provide a good base for implementing new features like CCD or specific steering logic. When you touch certain colliders or certain surfaces, how you want to correct penetration, how you want to clamp velocities, and based on slopes and angles, and all of this is very game specific. So yeah, try to. My suggestion is use the base one while you're prototyping until it no longer fit your needs, and you need to kind of change the behavior in the very roots of the logic. Then take the base implementation as a startup and build from it.
And you hit a very good point here, Daniel, which is character controller performance, where something like Unity's built-in character controller, it doesn't really perform well. So if you have a game with a bunch of players and a bunch of maybe NPCs, and then you also run a simulation with predict rollback on that, right? Then it like very quickly starts to eat up all your CPU budget. And with Quantum, that's a bit different because we have optimized ours for that. So that's something we do better than the built-in one, just because this is a use case specific for multiplayer, right? So we have optimized for that.
Yeah. Yeah, the built-in character controller uses a single sphere overlap. We want to make to support also capsule on the next version of Quantum, and a few other shapes we're working in. But yeah, the default one uses a single sphere overlap, which is one cheaper than shape casts, whatever shape you're using, and from all the shape overlaps, sphere is the cheapest one, and we only do one shape overlap. So yeah, it can't get much. And the deep penetration algorithm is a single pass one, so it basically cannot get much faster than this.
Yep. We have a good question here by Joseph, which is what's a performant or a good way to detect whether a player is grounded in Quantum?
Yeah, so raycast, shape overlap, collision callbacks. It depends, right? If you are talking about a character controller like Quantum, then the shape that detects collisions as a whole also functions to detect the ground, because the ground is just another collision that is considered a ground surface, for instance. Then yeah, essentially what grounded means is the angle between the surface and the gravity is small enough so that you can stand on it. And the definition of the small enough, it's configurable, right? So that's why we have on the KCC configuration on Quantum, we have a max slope angle above which the surface is not considered as ground anymore. So yeah, in the case of a character controller, then the shape overlap is better because you do not need to perform other queries. But you could, for instance, have a character controller that performs a few raycasts, for instance, four raycasts, one down, one up, and two to the sides for a 2D game. It might work better for your scenario, right? If you're working on with physics, vehicle physics, for instance, you probably want to work on raycasts for the wheels. Either one raycast per wheel or two per wheel, like on the sides of the wheel of the tire width. Collision callbacks, it's nice if you already have a collider, a physics collider, or you already need a physics collider or body for something else. Then yeah, you do not need to use a shape query or a shape overlap or a raycast to detect something that you could use collision callbacks because you already have the physics body in place. So if working with physics entities like with physics body, then yeah, collision callbacks might be the cheapest approach because you do not require a separate query to be solved. And for the case of queries, on Quantum we also have the concept of broad phase queries, right? So this is not something you have on physics engines like the ones Unity uses, but the idea is that you can like preemptively inject physics query before the physics runs, and they get all solved during the physics update pass, and then later after physics you just collect the results. Regular queries, they are kind of solved immediately when you perform the query. So you do the raycast, and the physics engine will kind of solve that, see which colliders this query hits. But the broad phase query, they can be solved much faster using the physics internal like acceleration structures and space partitioning strategies to make them really fast. So yeah, if you are working with physics queries, you have also that option to use broad phase queries.
Yes, and so if someone is using KCC, right, can they just access the grounded data from that itself, or?
So yeah, so if you're using the default KCC, the grounded state is available. It's not only available in the raw computation data, but you also have data like the closest surface tangent, the one that is closest to the center of the KCC, and the average surface tangent. So you could, for instance, use the closest surface tangent to work on the grounded state. And for the specific case of the default quantum character controller, we also have the extent amount, which is a small amount that is added to the radius of the KCC in order to allow the character controller grounded state to be more stable, because the fact that Unity CC is a single shape overlap, it can happen that, for instance, if you're steering over a mesh, a terrain, for instance, and you go over like an edge, and for one frame or two, you might not touch the ground. Correct, like you can be like barely above the ground, but not exactly touching. And so this extent can help you, like you are close enough to a ground surface that you can still consider the character as grounded, instead of like having your grounded state flickering very much for every small loss of contact you have with the ground. So the extent can help with that as well.
Yeah. So we have one more question by Busy, and this is actually a very good question. Since we do not have capsules, how do you deal with setting up a character that you would usually use a capsule collider, right? So you want to prevent it from being able to go like underneath a small crack because you still want it to be this 1.8 meters high, but you can't do that with a sphere, right? So do you
Yeah.
have any advice on that?
One possible way is that the character entity, can still have a collider that is not sphere shaped. So you could have, for instance, a box shaped collider on the entity that it kind of covers the length of the body, and then have the sphere, the character controller sphere at the bottom, at the feet, to like steer over a surface, and delegate the solving of this scenario you described, like cracks and places where you like want your character head to hit something. And you can even use a kinematic physics body on that same entity, and for instance have a velocity that is applied, the character controller velocity is also applied to this kinematic physics body. So when you collide with something with your collider, even though your KCC query is not touching anything. You're just touching with the top of the this collider box. You can still like interact with dynamic things and push them around and react. And the deep penetration logic of the physics engine will ensure that your character is pushed off from this collision you have on the top collider. That does not necessarily involve the steering sphere, let's call it this way, from the character controller. So yeah, it's one possible approach. The other one is we are working on a capsule for the next version of Quantum. It's something that we received quite a lot of requests, and yeah, we it's one of our priorities for the next Quantum version.
Yeah, I think the important part here is really the point you made that the character controller, it controls steering. It is not
Yes.
a part of the physics engine. And this is different from what you get with regular Unity physics, where the character controller also is a collider, right? So in our case, you need that separate collider, and it can be any shape. It can be a box, it can be a compound collider with two spheres on top of each other, right? So
Correct. Yeah.
and you need to think of the character controller more as a steering, as the feet of the character, because that's really where you move, right? You don't need
Hmm.
it to be accurate for collisions. That's what you have the collider for.
Hmm. Exactly. Yeah. And this approach I mentioned about, since we don't have new questions, I think I can comment about this approach I mentioned, because one question we constantly receive is how can I make my character, which has a character controller in Quantum, to interact with other dynamic objects, right? So as Luke said, the character controller by itself is not a physics entry. It is not a collider. It is not a physics body. It does not have mass. It does not have inertia or velocity. Well, it has its own velocity, but not in the in a way that the physics engine sees it. For the engine, character controller is invisible. It's just a query. It's just like a raycast you do when shooting a weapon. So yeah, to achieve this kind of interactions with other dynamic objects, a common approach is to combine a character controller and the physics collider, so you kind of becomes visible to the physics engine, and a kinematic physics body to like have mass and a proper dynamic, rigid body logic. Um, and the kinematic part is very important because if you have like a dynamic body and a character controller in the same entity, the result will not and is not expected to be good, because you essentially have two systems, each one with its own constraints. So like the dynamic body wants to be affected by gravity and collisions and frictions and restitution collisions and forces and all that stuff. And the SEC has its own constraints as well. It has its own gravity, it has its own logic for grounded, for steering and stuff. So if you have both, they would just like not agree with each other, and you have very weird behaviors. So the way to do is use a kinematic physics body. Kinematic physics body is essentially a body that is not moved by the physics. So the engine will not try to move it in any way, but it has a certain velocity, angular and linear velocity, that can be taken into consideration by the physics. So if your character controller with a kinematic collider hits a sphere, for instance, that is a soccer ball or whatever, then the dynamic code that handles the ball will say, okay, I collided with an object that is moving to this direction with this velocity and has this physics material. How should I behave? How should I respond to that? And then you have the expected result of dynamic interaction and a character controller working together. So this is one approach we like to suggest.
Yeah, and I think we have a follow-up question here about this, which is when you have a dynamic physics body and it goes into sleep mode, And then I think they are moving into that with exactly a character controller and a kinematic colliders. I think that's the case here. The body doesn't awake from sleep. Is that right?
Mhm.
So how would you approach something like that?
Yeah. So if you check on the physics on Quantum, if you check on the physics body config, one of the flags says is awakened by forces, right? So this essentially says that if a body should awaken, if it is sleeping and you apply a force to it, should it be awakened by the force? Because if this is disabled, the object is only awakened if it collides with something else, with another dynamic thing, or if you explicitly call wake up, and then it will wake up. Otherwise, forces will not wake it up as you might expect. So ensure you have these flag set on your physics body config and that says, okay, my body, if it is sleeping and it receives a force, it should be awakened. And you mentioned that, for instance, trying to make a cable with spring joints, I can drag the end, but only that follows. Yeah, if the other objects are not awakened by forces and they are sleeping, the the spring the end the cable at the end of the cable that is moving will not awake the other body. So yeah, one thing is to check that.
Exactly. I think we have time for one last question before we are going to end this stream. And this is whether we have future plans on entity hierarchies. And I think that's a very interesting topic we get asked about a lot, right, Daniel?
We do, yeah. So yeah, yeah, hierarchies, especially for developers coming from the game object world and object oriented and all this hierarchy that is very hierarchy dependent, they feel a lack of this same logic on the ECS approach, which can be implemented customly. You could have some like of a reference transform so that your that you can hold like a local offset relative to another entity's transform, and in a system you can enforce that relation in your main transform component for that entity. So it is possible to build something like that right now as in the quantum version you have. But yeah, we usually try to advise people that, for instance, on Fusion we hear a lot of people say, oh, I want to send RPCs for this and RPCs for that, and sometimes it's just not the best approach, even though people are very used to it. And the same applies to entity hierarchy in quantum. So a lot of people want to build things with hierarchy when many times it's not necessary or not even the best approach, and just add complexity and cost for the simulation itself. So but yeah, we agree that some cases could be better handled if the engine itself could express this kind of hierarchy relation of transform. So yes, we have plans to make it a thing on next quantum versions. As Luke said, we don't have ETAs, but it is on the plans. Yeah, to have a hierarchy system that can you can like design in prototypes on Unity and have like the hierarchy relation between these prototypes built on the quantum side once these prototypes are materialized. And this also must be taken into consideration by the physics engine when computing the collider internal state and such, like the world positions of colliders and stuff. So yeah, this all needs to be addressed.
Yeah, but as you mentioned, often there are other or better approaches for a
Yeah.
lot of things. So if you're unsure whether you need parenting for something, maybe just try to ask us on the Discord in the Quantum channel. Like sometimes we can give you a better approach to do something. Like if you
Mhm.
want to have a weapon in the player's hand or something like that, that's not something you would probably solve with parenting on like the simulation layer. It depends on the exact use case, but it's not needed in many cases. So yeah, with that being said, thank you guys all for attending today's Q&A session. We got some really good questions, especially in
Yeah.
your area, Daniel, about physics, right? So
Thanks
yeah.
about that, everyone. It was. I hope it was clear to everyone who asked and to everyone that was listening.
Yep, definitely was. I learned a lot as well from you. Um, we do have another stream on Friday where we will be playing your guys' games. There will be a forum to submit it, and then, yeah, we will have a bit of fun. So this won't be the judging around. It will just be us Photonians trying out your games, giving some feedback, exploring your approaches to multiplayer. So it's gonna be a super fun little session. And yeah, with that, the end of the game jam is coming near. Yeah,
Nice, sounds fun.
yeah. Well, then, have a nice day, everyone. Goodbye.
Nice to hear everyone.